Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 25, chapter 25, entitled Crisis of Self. The night came swift and sudden, and Midoriya found himself holed up in his room, with only the moonlight to witness his secrets. The hours creeped by painfully slow, however, and the quiet sounds of darkness seemed to resonate much louder in his head. The digital clock beside his bed continued to flash its red numberings so consistently that he was starting to associate its pattern with the repetitive noise echoing from right outside his window. 2:46, 2:46, 2:46. Annoyed, he flipped over to face the other side of the room, tossing the blankets along with him. The teen had gone to bed almost an hour ago, after sorting through however many souls his tired eyes could handle in the darkness, but in reality, he hadn't gotten a wink of sleep yet. He was exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open, and yet he just wasn't able to drift off. The stars twinkled through the window pane, and they only reminded him of how late it was and how tired he'd be in the morning, but even that wasn't enough. Just don't do that again. It was really scary. He sat up in frustration, completely throwing the blankets off of him. He wiped the small beads of sweat off his forehead like he'd just awoken from a nightmare. Unable to shake the anxiety that had been passively pulling in his stomach, he remained still, just sitting up on the bed, huddling himself closer. No, Moo, stop playing around and end him. He was fine. There was no reason to feel like this. The day was over. He had gotten through it all. Still, why was it now that the world seemed to be crumbling around him? Or is it always like this and he had only realized it now, in the solitude of his room? You don't belong as a hero, especially not with a dangerous quirk like that. He nervously looked around, but that only reaffirmed his loneliness. Gami was gone, as the ghost usually claimed he was while he slept, but he never managed to fall asleep in the first place, just lying painfully still under the covers. Did his mentor mistake that for a peaceful rest and presumed that it was free for him to leave, or did the spirit know all along and left anyway? If the latter was the case, he honestly couldn't blame him. Today had been rough for everyone, and that was putting it extremely lightly, and yet Gami still found all the time in the world to reassure him. Did that make him selfish for completely overlooking his needs, however small they may have been? Come on, I want to hear that heroic facade of yours break. Thankfully, after Tsukuuchi had left, he finally found the time to take a well-needed shower and change some clothes, now that he was dressed comfortably in a cozy pair of pajamas, which really just consisted of a t-shirt and some broken-in sweatpants. But his skin still felt itchy, in a sense just uncomfortable to reside in. Was it the worry in his blood or the decay that had lived right beneath his fingertips? He couldn't quite put his finger on it, just housing the simple acknowledgement that something just wasn't right, whether that was the world's fault or his own. If you're going to keep getting in my way, then I'll just target you instead. He looked down at his unwrapped arms, having removed most of the bandages after showering. Some of the ribs were still sensitive, so Yamada helped him reapply the ones around his chest, but other than that, he insisted on letting his skin breathe, or something like that. Really, he just didn't want to feel the rub of bandages on his skin anymore, since he couldn't help but go back to the memories of being in Recovery Girl's office. Midoriya, dear, you would have died. Even in the pale moonlight, he could still clearly define 5 fingers that were imprinted onto his right forearm. Stroking his free hand over the scar, he shuddered at the change in texture, finding his mind unconsciously slipping back to the events that had occurred literally hours ago. Was it this? Was it that this was bothering him? That this was itching away at his skin? He couldn't help but feel it slithering under there, uncomfortable and tense, and God, he wanted it gone. The mindless soft tracing with his free hand wasn't going to soothe enough of the itch away that he wanted so desperately to cease, so he just pressed harder. His nails began to dig in and chip away at the surface level, but it wasn't enough, so he continued faster. But nothing he was doing was satisfactory. Nothing he was doing helped. He could still feel the grip Shigaraki had on him. Even after all these hours, it needed to stop. He needed it to stop. Why wasn't it stopping? What are you doing? Stop scratching! And then, before he could realize it, his left hand was strung into the air, hanging limply as if it had no more reason to live. Distinctly bony fingers were held up there, and while their cold chill was usually comforting, he couldn't help but draw parallels to how Shigaraki had held his others. But He didn't really have the energy to pry it out, or maybe it was motivation he was lacking. He couldn't find it within him to try and fight back, whether that was necessary or not. "What were you thinking? Any further, you likely would have broken the skin." Would he? He didn't even notice he was pressing that hard, but at the same time, the thought of allowing such a mark to remain nearly made his heart pierce through his chest. The teen thought he was fine, after all. He did unravel the bandages in front of everyone. He hadn't a problem then, so why was it now that he hated looking at the discolored skin? Why was it now that it made him sick? He felt his raised arm being slowly lowered back to the side, and upon its release, he didn't even have the heart to move it. It was as if he was floating in limbo, and the air around him was made of a liquid lead. He knew that he was breathing, but it still felt like he was drowning. The breath stuck in his throat and yet moving freely through his nose. Excruciating and contradictory, and God, could he pick one already? "You know there is nothing wrong with crying. Paradise knows you probably need it most of all of us." He didn't need to cry. He just needed to breathe a deep, long breath all the way to the bottoms of his lungs, because the air sure wasn't making it there. Who even cared if he was crying? That didn't matter, and he wasn't going to check even if it did, because he was fine. There was absolutely nothing wrong. He was fine before, so he was fine now. He didn't need to cry. The boy was scooped up and subsequently embraced in a reassuring hug. It wasn't tight or warm, just comforting in the sense that nothing could go wrong in that moment. It felt much nicer than the heavy air around him, albeit a bit cold, and he unconsciously leaned into it. The hug was soft, though he still couldn't manage lifting his arms to savor more of it. A stray hand pressed into his hair, holding him close and threading its fingers through his curls. It was nice, and the chill wasn't all too distracting. It fueled his heart just enough that he swore he heard it sigh in relief. See? All he needed was a breath. He didn't need to cry. There you go. Just let it all out. He wasn't crying, just breathing. Besides, there was no noise in the room. It was as if it needed to be freeing, peaceful. He was pulled closer, but that was fine, even if he didn't admit it out loud. There was warmth in the cold, just as there was noise in the silence, regardless of how well he could tell one from the other. Just as there was comfort in the dark, there could be tears in dry eyes. The sobs only grew louder, but thankfully were muffled by the embrace that he was in. He didn't need to cry. There was hurt and healing, as there was pain in breathing, and Midoriya finally lifted his arms to grip back, digging his fingers unconsciously deeper in hopes that it would stabilize him. He didn't need to cry. There was presence in absence, just like there was hesitance in admittance. Was Kami back yet? I am always here if you need me. Little listener, you're up later than usual. Midoriya stumbled out of his room, closing the door behind him. He rubbed tiredly at his eyes, bright sunlight peeking from underneath the crack of the doorway. His hair was still a wild mess, not having bothered to comb it down. It seemed as if he'd stopped and sloppily changed into new clothes by the way that they were so messily thrown on his body. He swayed unsteadily with each step, almost like he was waking up from a hangover. Kami trailed behind, trying to make sure the boy didn't topple over onto himself, but of course Yamada didn't see that. I didn't sleep very well, he replied with a wide yawn, dragging himself into the open area. He pulled out one of the island seats before practically throwing himself into it and collapsing against the counter. Unsure of what to say, the blonde chuckled awkwardly at the exhausted mess in front of him, reaching back to scratch at his neck. He moved from his spot by the stove to face the teen across the island counter, coffee mug in tow. Want something to drink? Hot chocolate? Midoriya only had the energy to nod before his head toppled right back into resting upon his crossed arms, making Yamada chuckle nervously once more. The hero then turned away back to the stove and set the kettle out, lighting the burner after a few start-up clicks. A noise stirred from behind him in the living room, but he was too tired to check. Thankfully, he didn't have to, as whatever it was gradually grew louder and closer to his dying form. Nice to see you aren't worried about missing class, problem child, Aizawa quipped as he placed his used mug by the sink. Even from his hiding spot in his arms, the boy rolled his eyes dramatically, making the spirit next to him chuckle. If we had school, I'm sure you would have chastised me by now. Aizawa huffed heavily under his breath, but no one could miss his attempt to smother a laugh. Everyone seemed to be in a better mood compared to yesterday, and that was more than enough to be thankful for. Even Midoriya's cranky attitude was appreciated, as it allowed everyone to fall into a peaceful family dynamic that was quite pleasant for all parties involved. It was like they had always been this normal, and no one was taken from an awful home or struggling to cope within new walls or recovering after surviving a hostile attack or crying themselves to sleep at night. Everyone was smiling and the air was warm. God, could you ask for anything more than that? Do you think I could partake in my own cup of hot chocolate? The teen didn't bother lifting his head, but the smirk on his face was more than audible as he shuffled around. Kami, can you even drink hot chocolate? Yamada swiveled around, the conversation loud enough to make him want to participate, instant cocoa packets still in hand. Gami wants hot chocolate. I can make him some. That would be greatly appreciated. No, the boy giggled, forgetting that he was tired in the first place. Don't entertain him. He'll just make a mess everywhere. The ghost immediately snapped to attention at that. I would not. The voice hero then laughed heartily even at hearing only half of the conversation, and shook the packets in the air before turning back to watch the kettle on the stove. Aizawa, too, joined in, still by the sink washing his coffee mug. If Gami makes a mess, he'll have to clean it up himself, he clarified over the running water. Do you all simply have no faith in me? He pouted, placing a dramatic hand over where his heart would be, but even then the cheer in his voice was noticeable. The teasing dissolved into laughter among the wonderfully calm atmosphere. It was so alien, and yet everyone seemed to fall into it naturally. It was as if they all fit into each other perfectly, like long-lost puzzle pieces. And sure, it could all be explained away as coping after yesterday's obscene stress, but there was something freeing about this moment. Something that could only be described as progress. They were getting better. Everyone was getting better. Yamada turned back around, and, like a master bartender, slid a cup of hot cocoa across the counter to him. Admittingly, that probably wasn't a good idea, as a few drops had spilled over the top, but it didn't result in a disaster. He then quickly moved to mop up the mess that he made, before his partner noticed, but that didn't stop one ghost from pointing it out. See? He gestured his hand to the hero that was frantically cleaning up before him. You are all mistaken. Midoriya grabbed the mug with his gloved hand, still feeling the warmth seep through the polyester. That only proves Yamada-sensei makes messes, doesn't prove that you can't. Gami groaned and threw his hands up in an exasperated huff, just as Aizawa turned around to see the blonde hunched over the counter with a paper towel, and, also, with a sigh under his breath, he shook his head in a mock disappointment, leaning back against the sink after finishing. The teen lifted the cup to take a sip, wanting to finally start his morning, before looking over to the transparent mentor he had. He pondered for a moment, and then set his mug back down, pushing it slowly down the counter towards him. Here, he stated. Can you grab it? The spirit looked over in confusion, thinking his successor had taken his light-hearted self-teasing too seriously. But he listened, reaching one of his ghostly hands over to the glass. The two pros watched carefully as well, waiting patiently and quietly for the mug to move. Neither made a sound, as the mug never did. I cannot. He shook his head. The boy frowned, pausing to reassess the situation. Give me your hand, then. The other three looked even more confused than before, no clue where he was going with this, but regardless, the spectre opened out his palm, unsure of where to put it. To his surprise, Midoriya grabbed it in his own and held it against the mug, confusing the two heroes even more so. Still, the ghost passed through it, but to his bewilderment, he was able to feel the warmth through the teen's hand. It is so comforting, he managed to mumble out, afraid to even stir. Warm, right? Midoriya smiled gently. I think that's the best part. It was so odd, yet so satisfying to feel the contrast to his great chill. He really liked it, more so than he ever would have imagined. I am inclined to agree. The two continued to bathe in the silence, even as the warmth was slowly fading from the cup. Noticing this, Gami sent the boy a swift nod, not wanting to break the serenity that even the other pros were observing. Midoriya released his hand, allowing the ghost to pull it back, and slid the mug back towards him, finally getting to take a small sip. The spirit held open his palm in the air for a little while, trying to will the remaining wisps of warmth to stay with him. He could admit, the feeling was odd and unfamiliar, but that didn't make it bad by any means. If anything, he preferred it over the apathetic chill. The warmth made him feel as if he were alive again. But the returning cold reminded him of the bitter reality he was living. Surprisingly, Gami rarely pondered his afterlife, nor the situation he was in. As bizarre as both were, he merely regarded them as events that happened and moved on to a new thought, simply because pressing for more about them left his head achy and hazy. It didn't help that he was beginning to feel things he'd never felt before, and remembering things that he believed were lost to whatever void had consumed him. All they did was leave him with more unanswered questions that he wasn't expecting to resolve anytime soon. It didn't help that he'd been bottling the entirety of these experiences to himself, but he was afraid to speak them aloud, as if the very echo of the memory would cause it to disappear once more. Gami knew he was a lot of things, but one of those things he was an idiot. Despite his lack of recollection, he held far more trust in himself than he even realized. Sure, he wasn't positive if his absent memory was just typical protocol after retirement or something else entirely, but the way he unconsciously felt protective over the few memories he had, and the few coming back to him, he would be a fool to ignore that inkling from his soul. He wasn't sure what to think just yet, but until he did, he'd make great effort to keep those thoughts to himself. Though, that didn't mean he had to isolate himself from the few things in this world that brought him back to an unplaceable bliss. He cherished the bits of warmth he was able to experience, as they were only things that were keeping him from running cold with an undead chill. He turned to see Midoriya setting down his mug with a relaxed sigh after taking another small sip, a bright smile still plastered on his lips. "This is so good. I wish I could drink it all already," he complained to presumably the ghost that was standing beside him. "But it's still too hot." "I think it is good, Kimuni-chan, but can I finish it after it cools off? It burns my tongue." Gami winced, holding a cold hand to catch his head, but he forcefully pulled it back down before his successor could notice and ask him. Having finished his coffee, Yamada moved to place it by the sink, to which Aizawa grumbled, but plucked it back up along with the sponge. The blonde hero laughed sheepishly, but otherwise moved for the door. He began, slipping on shoes and a jacket, making everyone turn at the noise and furrow at the sight. "Where are you off to, Zashi?" the underground hero joked. "Thought you'd be staying home with us all day." About that," he chuckled awkwardly, scratching his neck nervously. "I got a call from Nezu this morning about a staff meeting concerning what happened yesterday." Aizawa immediately perked up, nearly dropping Yamada's mug in the sink. "Staff meeting? Well, let me go get my shoes on." "Oh, no, you're staying home," Yamada interrupted forcefully. "Last time I checked, you didn't get a call from Nezu, did you?" The black-haired hero looked stunned, flabbergasted even. "What? Zashi, I can't just not go." "Oh, yes, you can. You're supposed to be resting, remember?" The deathly duo could only watch, their heads swiveling back and forth in an attempt to keep up with the conversation. Yamada and Aizawa bickered back and forth, no real argument taking place, and yet the air was scorched with heat. Neither bothered to say a word, their voices being inevitably drowned out by the pre-existing noise. Besides, the last thing Midoriya wanted to do right now was draw attention to himself when they were like this, the mere thought making him shiver. He suddenly felt uncomfortable, and his instincts ached to be in the solitude of his room. His groggy conscience was finally waking up, and he was not at all ready for this. Fighting, yelling, arguing, no matter how intense, he simply wasn't ready to witness it before his very eyes. "Look, I have to go. You're staying, that's final," Yamada punctualized. "Don't even think about going behind my back." And with that, the voice hero didn't even stay for a response, yanking the front door open and walking out. He shut the door behind him with a powerful thud, leaving a resonating echo in his wake, of both noise and other things. Aizawa grumbled under his breath before storming back to the sink to finish washing his partner's cup. Now feeling thoroughly uncomfortable, Midoriya snaked off his seat at the island counter and slithered quietly back to his room, hot chocolate still in hand. Gami followed close behind, but neither said a word even upon arriving at their destination. Just as there was joy in completion, there was dysfunction to bring back the challenge. The one called Shigaraki. Yamada sat quietly beside Nezu in a conference room, as Tsukauchi had stood in the empty space in the center, a group of papers in his hands. He held his own set of papers, what he presumed were copies of what the detective was reading off of. He shifted in his seat, feeling his back start to arc uncomfortably after nearly an hour of sitting in the same position upright. He couldn't help but feel the minutes drag on despite the intensity of the information present. "His quirk allows him to disintegrate anything he touches," Tsukauchi continued, filing through his notes. The hero called that from both of his partners and Midoriya's account, as well as the gruesome markings on the boy's wrist. He was one of the few villains that did manage to escape, and for that he nearly couldn't forgive himself. Beside him, Nezu adjusted himself in his oversized chair, beginning to lean into the table. "We've been through the list of men in their 20s and 30s in the quirk registry," the officer sighed, "with no luck." And that nearly made Yamada sigh along with him. Of course it wouldn't have been that easy. He remembered Aizawa mentioning the quirk registry back when this issue could have been labeled away at a one-time assailant, although it seemed this grander problem couldn't be so easily solved. Then Shigaraki might have been an alias, which was going to make things a lot harder. Plus, if his quirk wasn't even registered in the national database, then they were all essentially working under completely blank slates. Nothing to go off of, no leads, not even a visible starting line. They were essentially going into this blind. The thought nearly made Yamada's head collapse into his hands in pure helplessness. He'd been feeling a lot of that lately. Nothing turned up on the warp gate user, Kurogiri, either. Neither is registered, and we're both using aliases. As disappointing as that was, it made perfect sense. If they couldn't find Shigaraki in the system, why would they find Kurogiri? They were obviously the ringleaders behind the attack. The other villains captured were merely replaceable, troops in a greater war. Behind a greater cause, as delusional as that may have been. Their quirks are not on record, making them members of the underworld, he added, swapping out his current paper for the next one in his stack. Snipe, who was a few seats down the table, frustratingly threw the paper he was holding onto the table, presumably using it to follow along with the detective. A hiss came from his signature mask, likely originating as a sigh of annoyance. "So you're saying we know next to nothing?" the sharpshooter reiterated. "'Cause then I reckon we ought to learn fast." Yamada turned to look at his colleague, noticing Nezu and All Might, who was beside the principal, do the same. He watched Snipe's eyes shadow over even from under the mask and the cowboy hat he regularly adorned. "Or the leader of those varmints, Shigaraki. His wounds will heal and he'll be back again." A heavy silence fell over the group of heroes as the premise of another targeted attack settled in their minds. It was inevitable. If Shigaraki went through all the trouble to break into USJ just to get a shot at All Might, then the rest of the school where he worked was easy pickings as well. The rest of the staff, the students, they would all be in danger. Even now, after the invasion was resolved, as long as he and his partner remained at large, everyone that attended UA remained in constant danger. UA was supposed to be the greatest school for heroes in the country, but how could they ever hope to maintain that title with this ever-looming sense of dread hanging over them? Adding anxiety and stress and swirled together was an uneasy cocktail practically forced down their throats. Right beside the mammal, All Might averted his gaze, instead opting to look back in his direction, though not looking at anyone in particular. A profound scowl was set on his face, yet one more of deep thought than anger. "Leader, huh." Nezu picked up on his mumblings, leaning more towards him. "What is it, All Might?" The number 1 hero dropped his shoulders, raising his hands in the air in exasperation. "It's just that it was an especially daring attack." All eyes turned curiously to the skeleton of a man whose serious tone never left his eyes. It was slightly intimidating, his bright blue pupils against the sunken shadows of the rest of his face, a standout cool tone flared with the burning sensation of gravity. "Nothing about this feels normal," he continued, a furrow in his brows, "and not just due to the meticulous planning, either." Could any of this be felt as normal? Of course Yamada presumed the hero had something of much more importance to say, but he found himself unable to compartmentalize his emotions towards this event. Everything felt almost unbelievable, and he wasn't there long enough to properly separate the suspicious from the unfathomable. It made him feel useless in a sense, only able to sit and listen without providing any insight of his own. He'd been feeling a lot of that lately. He started going on and on about some ridiculous ideology, All Might explained, recounting his own experiences at the USJ. And although he didn't say anything about his own quirk, he was still shooting his mouth off, bragging about that guy, Nomu's quirk. Yamada remembered that vaguely from Midoriya's account, but again, it didn't really stick out to him as something, as he wasn't there to witness it. To him, it simply felt like another delusional villain spouting off ridiculous nonsense in their warped sense of justice. Nothing too out of the ordinary, though villains with ideology in the first place were uncommon compared to those who simply hungered for power. Again, however, he wasn't truly there and had no right to assume or generalize. And so, that dreadful feeling of not being able to contribute settled right back in the pits of his stomach. And when things didn't go his way, he started throwing a tantrum. All Might's tone began to grow further heated as he grew more intense, his long fingers collapsing into fists. It was much easier to remember how intelligent the #1 hero was while detransformed. His buff form and muscle-head fighting style easily gave off the impression of all brawn and little brain, but he wasn't in the #1 spot by strength alone. So that left the obvious question of where he was going with this, because there was obviously a reason, and yet Yamada felt himself scratching his head. It didn't help that he was attempting to figure it out before the man outright said it, and especially without all the pieces. All Might settled down, realizing he was getting a bit loud for the small conference room that they were all seated in. "Well, I guess the business about the quirks was meant to provoke me." "Even so," Nezu interjected, having fully known exactly where he was going with this. "It seems especially foolish in a battle against heroes to reveal one's quirks and waste the element of surprise." That was true. It seemed his priorities were all over the place, and those kinds of villains were the most unsettling of all. There was something reassuring about predictability, and outliers almost became skipped heartbeats, sudden and uncomfortable. Spouting a plausible yet deluded ideology, bragging about the toy that he'd brought along, and simple-mindedly thinking everything would go his way. All Might listed upon his fingers. If we think about how this attack was carried out, it seems it's clear that this Shigaraki character couldn't quite hide his childish nature. There was a moment of silence, so thick that Yamada was almost sure he'd suffocate in it. No one dared interject here, waiting for that final drop that they knew was coming. "He's a man-child." In all honesty, that phrase shouldn't have been as funny as it sounded, especially with the context surrounding it, but it sure took a lot of willpower for Yamada to not crack a smile. "A kid with too much power, you're saying?" the voice hero asked, finally feeling the air to contribute. "Maybe he never received general quirk counseling in elementary school." Pro-hero Midnight finally spoke, having remained silent for the entirety of the meeting so far. "So?" Vlad King exclaimed, also not having said a word since the start of this. "What does that matter anyway?" And with only a slight rustle of papers, Tsukuchi calmed the brewing storm, focusing everyone back on him. "We apprehended a total of 72 villains at the USJ yesterday." "Huh?" The blonde hero interrupted unconsciously, but the detective paid him no mind. "They were all pretty much just back-alley thugs, but that begs the question, why would so many of them agree to follow this man-child?" That was actually a good point. Yamada rarely was able to experience the world of underground, but from the stories he gathered from Aizawa, it was a ruthless place, and it was an eat-or-be-eaten type of mentality there. It was more than odd that 72 rugged evildoers would agree to just follow a character like Shigaraki, even from the little he knew about him. "Nowadays, our society is saturated with heroes," Tsukuchi continued without much pause. "So, maybe small-time villains like them, who always get kicked around, are drawn in by that sort of pure, unaffected evil." "Didn't Midori mention a sensei character as well? Shigaraki had an ideology, but it didn't reflect much of that pure, unaffected evil. That would have been necessary to rally up so many foes, but what about this sensei individual? Could they have that sort of uncontrollable evil that the detective was referencing? Despite how little he knew of this character, how little anyone knew, really, would it be possible that they were responsible for collecting troops? Anyone that Shigaraki would possibly look up to had to be strong or cunning, superior to him in every possible way that it wasn't arguable. After all, along with a childish nature came an unrelinquished pride that was impossible to deny. "Anyways, thanks to you heroes, we can focus on our investigation," Tsukuchi continued. "We've got a few good leads to hone in on, so we'll expand our search and devote our efforts to apprehending the perpetrators." Nezu, who had remained surprisingly quiet throughout the meeting, finally settled back in his chair, looking down at his paws. "A man-child. Everyone turned from the detective to the albino rodent whose beady black, seeming to sparkle in sorrow, eyes. His ears fell flat against his head, reminding everyone that he was indeed an animal despite his massive intelligence. "In a way, he's a lot like our students." The principal spoke softly, and Yamada swore he could hear a hint of true melancholy in his voice. "He has the potential to grow, if only he had a proper mentor to follow." Those were an interesting choice of words, because Shigaraki likely had a mentor he was following. Did Nezu realize this? Of course he did. He was the principal. Did Nezu know that in the first place? Of course he did. Again, he was the principal. It was more than likely Tsukuchi told him about the few tidbits that Midori had mentioned in his account. A proper mentor. How hard was it to live up to a title like that? And Yamada wasn't asking rhetorically what truly made a proper mentor from a decent one. It seemed simple enough to draw the distinction, and yet the lines were just as simple to blur. The more he pondered the thought, the more it began to hurt his head. Yamada really didn't want to imagine what kind of villain Shigaraki's sensei might be. Nezu sighed as well, almost as if he was able to read the voice hero's thoughts, just as they were forming in his head. It's difficult to think about these things. You have been staring at that empty cup for a while now. Midoriya let out a heavy huff and set the mug down on his desk a bit rougher than he intended. He could feel the tension in his shoulders, so he let them collapse against the back of his chair. He knew he was beginning to grow annoyed. He could feel it in his gut, but Gami didn't deserve that. It wasn't the ghost's fault, not by any means. Actually, he's not really sure whose fault it was. He just wasn't feeling all too great. He'd been in his room ever since Yamada had left for his staff meeting, which admittedly wasn't very long ago, but the silence sure made it feel that way. He was sure the awkwardness from earlier didn't exactly help either, though he wasn't sure how mad Aizawa actually was, even through the volume of the yelling. Maybe it was all these deductions and uncertainties that he was attempting that were making him feel as frustrated as he was. He focused back at his desk, noticing where he had placed the empty cup. A little nervously, he moved it farther towards the edge away from the sharp manila folder that was near. The folder that was the one that Tsukuji had given him last night before leaving, and surprisingly, he had already read it over a few times now. The teen always believed he'd be too anxious to look even if he managed to get his hands on closure, but to his dismay, he read it again for maybe the 8th time while he still had a full cup of cocoa. He knew that Gami was worried about his constant trips back to the folder's contents, but it still felt sort of unreal to him. The man who did so much right here at his fingertips. He wasn't sure how resolved it truly made him feel, knowing he was in possession of tragedy once again. Maybe it was because deep in his subconscious he knew that despite holding it, he really wasn't in control of the tragedy, that it could strike at any moment, and he may never see it coming. He would never be in control of the tragedy, no matter his efforts. He would remain a backseat driver to his own life as misfortune seemed to smack it about every which way it pleased. Maybe that's why he needed to read over the file as many times as he did. He fingered the smooth edge through his glove, toying with the closed flap once more. He wanted to flip it open again, just because he could. Should he? Well, it probably wasn't necessary, but that didn't mean it was wrong. Besides, he had time. It wasn't like he had somewhere to be or someone that needed him. He wasn't going to deny the urge to read its contents again, even if he wasn't exactly positive where that urge stemmed from. Why not instead bring your cup back to the sink? The ghost urged him upon seeing the direction his successor was headed. He could do that, but he could always do that later. What was a few minutes going to hurt? It wasn't like he was never going to leave his room. Just after this. That was fair. It was the best of both worlds. It wasn't even like the first time anymore. The first time he opened the crisp manila folder, he felt his heart pump unnaturally fast, desperately attempting to supply the blood needed to his stress-ridden body. The first time he opened it, Gami had to check him to make sure he wasn't going to start hyperventilating, because he was sure he was about to, despite how aware he was, and he would have been, of it in the first place. The first time he opened it, he barely even managed to part the pages, his hands shaking so badly it registered on a seismograph. But now, he didn't do any of that. He didn't even feel the need to. It was practically natural. Which was a statement in itself, considering he had only received the folder last night. He hadn't even spent a full 24 hours with it, yet it felt as ordinary as his deathly abilities. Well, maybe that wasn't the best comparison. Regardless, all he needed was a perfectly typical exhale for him to gather all the courage to open it up once more, a true improvement from how he handled this the first time. The pages were out of order compared to how it was originally given to him, but that wasn't necessarily bad. In fact, he began leaving them so after the first few times reading through, after realizing what he always beelined for every time he came back. It was magnetic, drawing him into whatever he knew was never going to change. How could this be? Growing comfortable in the most unrelenting and brutal form of honesty. He settled on the top piece of paper, holding it gently in his gloved hands as if it would decay at his touch. Even after all this time, he still couldn't help his feathery touches. Maybe he was more nervous than he truly admitted, but nonetheless, he raised the sheet closer to his face, despite being able to see it fine from a distance. His tongue slowly traced over the words as he read them in his head, lips mocking the sounds in silence. Quirk name, Digitus Missile. Type, transformation. Activation, willful intent. Deactivation, willful intent. Size limit, not applicable. Range limit, 120 feet. Amount limit, 1 fire per every Digitus finger. General description. Digitus Missile allows the user to fire their Digitus fingers up to 120 feet from their hand. Fired fingers will explode in a manner similar to the effects of gunpowder, though lacking majorly in heat and smoke. Fingers begin to regenerate immediately after disconnecting from the hand, and therefore 2 identical Digitus fingers can exist at the same time. Firings tend to cause slight recoil blowback to the user, but when fired individually in a finger gun formation, the second hand holding for support, blowback is reduced dramatically, and aim is increased as an added bonus. Even when inactive, the user's hands tend to reek slightly of sulfur. Drawbacks. After every fire, the missile finger must regenerate completely in order to be fired again. The initial fire has a cooldown period of 0.1 seconds, and all fires afterwards have their cooldown periods doubled by the total amount of firings per that specific finger. To reset all cooldown periods back to 0.1 seconds, no firings must occur 1 hour after the last regenerated finger. Thumbs cannot be fired. Surprisingly, information about the quirk captured his attention the most the first time. Maybe it was his joy of quirk analysis unconsciously tampering with his judgment, which was a little sickening when he really thought about it. To be so interested in the quirk that ended the life of arguably his closest friend, it reeked of disgust to his conscience, yet it was the top page for a reason. It was the page he found himself reading over and over, trying to figure out based on basic notes alone if there was a way that disaster could have been avoided. Maybe the villain could have aimed better and was in too much of a rush. Maybe the villain could have taken a few steps back, would have put him out of range. Or maybe he could have fired a few more fingers earlier so the regeneration time would have been slower. No, that was an awful thing to wish. What if a few blasts earlier resulted in something even more disastrous? A few shots more could have killed someone else's closest friend, and he wouldn't wish that on anyone, even his worst enemy. No one deserved to feel that kind of loss. Ever. He remembered nearly throwing this paper to the ground the first time he read it. He remembered the sheer level of anger that flooded his system, uncontrollable rage like he'd never felt before. The quirk was amazing, and so it only hurt much more than this that this was what it became. How could anyone let themselves fall like this? How could anyone become so compliant with their own lifestyle when it consisted of destruction and suffering in the hands of those around them? How could anyone take such a gift and stomp on it until it was practically unrecognizable? Even now he could still feel his blood boil, albeit much less hot than the first time, but boil nonetheless. It was really bothering, seeing what he valued so highly be disrespected as such. Was he a little mad that his words rang just a bit true right back at him? Yeah, he was. But it was so much easier to channel his anger at the information in his hands. It was always easier to be angry at someone else. That was human nature. It wasn't Midoriya's nature, but this was an exception he was willing to make. The teen shook himself out of his thoughts with a huff and sat down the page to the offside of his desk. He was done with that for now, having enough of the bittersweet quirks and empty theorizing. He was almost tempted to stand up and leave right then and there, suddenly done with his current attempt at looking through the contents of the folder. But the next page caught the corner of his eye. Just how he left it the last time, he knew exactly what was important to his fragmented soul. His past self probably knew that even better than he gave it credit for, and that's exactly why he settled back down and picked up that second page. Even though it was set as the second page in the folder, it was arguably more magnetic than the first. Even his angry rationality noted that the contents on the second page should have been more prioritized than they were. He could admit it was really difficult to read over that second page. Maybe that's why he didn't leave it first. He was going to go back to this folder no matter what, no matter how many times were truly unknown. And so it was healthier not to see his face every single time he opened the manila flaps back up. Full name, Kiori Ryoyami. Age, 38. Height, 5'11". Weight, 174 pounds. Occupation, sales manager at. Address, blank. Quirk, Digitus Missile. Charges filed, blank. Charges dismissed, not applicable. Bail, blank. Court date, blank. The file was bare, to say the least. There was almost nothing on the sheet of paper other than blank space and blurred lines, and yet it rang out to his soul so loudly it was nearly impossible to put down, because for once he finally had a name and a face to put his emotional turmoil behind, regardless if that was what he truly needed. Other than the messy blotch of text, there was one other important aspect that kept drawing him back to this page, a set of profile pictures messily paperclipped to the edge. Though he could detach them and leave them separate, he never found a reason to do so, always clipping them back to their designated spot in the upper right-hand corner of the sheet. This time the boy unclipped them again, held them close to his face as he did. He found himself instantly studying the man's appearance, looking for something maybe. Of what he wasn't sure. He was never sure. But his conscience needed a face to put behind the name, because this was a real person, which was so easy to forget, purposefully or by accident. This was a real person who had real consequences for their real actions, who took real lives with their real decisions, who chose this real path. The man in his hands had tan skin, nearly olive in color. The shape of his head was plump, squarish, rugged in a sense. His nose matched in proportions, but his lips were unusually thin, especially for his build. His neck was stocky, and though most of his upper body was cut off, it was likely he was a heavy-set person. His head adorned no hair, just rough skin, not even shiny. It was so peculiar, seeing that his appearance was so misleading. He looked so much older than he really was, at least compared to the information in the report. But what really stuck out to Midoriya was the set of eyes that stared back. Flat with sharp corners, his eyes nearly plowed right through his being, like a runaway train with no intention of stopping. His gray pupils pierced his own, the color so abnormally dull he assumed it was unnatural, but his gaze held no trace of malice. Those eyes weren't the ones he'd expect to see with a man associated with evil. They just looked so normal, so very average and civilian. Even after the many times he'd analyzed the photos, he still couldn't pinpoint how or why they appeared that way. One of Gami's bony hands waved right in his face, startling him out of his deep trance and into the back of his chair. Would now be a more opportune time to take the cup back to the sink? The ghost asked again, though this time it felt a bit more forceful. Midoriya sighed. Reattaching the pictures to the report they came with, Gami was really trying to get him away from this folder, but he honestly couldn't blame him. He'd really been obsessed with the thing ever since Tsukuchi had supplied him with it, but he also found it so difficult to put down for good. But his mentor had a point, as he always did. Nothing was going to come out of rereading and brooding, and he wasn't going to find any new information this time. Maybe it was time to step out of the stuffy room, even if it was only under the impression of taking his mug to the kitchen. The teen tucked away that page underneath the ones that he previously read, re-establishing the order of his desires. He could feel almost an air of excitement once he closed the manila folder, though that was likely from the spirit behind him. His hand lay rested on top of the folder, still trying to force it closed for good. But the longer it lay there, the more he couldn't bring himself to do so. There was just something about the folder, its contents more specifically, that just wouldn't let him go. Or maybe it was him that just couldn't let go. Despite all of this, everything now and everything in his future, could he ever really be done with this? Would he ever really be done with it? This was supposed to be his resolution, Ishihara's resolution, and yet he couldn't help but feel the same way he had all this time. This aching, gaping hole in his heart that he just couldn't fill, that ate away at him every day of his life. Just make sure to remember your biggest fan when you go pro. He frustratingly slammed both of his hands against the wood of his desk, his shoulders dropping in defeat soon after. Not expecting the outburst at all, Gami flinched back startled and hesitated in stepping in. Isu, are you all right? But his successor just waved him off dismissively, standing abruptly from his chair. Before the ghost could try to say anything more, the boy grabbed his dejected mug and sulked out of the room, closing the door behind him. Not like that could prevent his mentor from following, though. Gami sighed helplessly, dropping his shoulders as well. He turned back to the desk, whose surface was completely cleared with nothing but the empty hue of black paint to stare back at him. That folder was truly magnetic. Aizawa sat on the couch by himself, staring emptily into silence. He hadn't moved much since Yamada left, lacking any purpose to do so. His mind kept wandering back to earlier, trying to see how he could have handled that better. But amongst his heaviness and bandages, he was having a hard time thinking straight. He wasn't mad at the blonde by any means, but unfortunately he wasn't sure if his partner understood that before leaving. If anything, he was just frustrated. Frustrated at his explosiveness, frustrated at his weakness, frustrated at feeling the lowest he had been in a while. He was a strong hero. He was a strong individual. He was a force to be reckoned with, his cold yet calculating demeanor, the first to taste all that tried to take him down. So it felt utterly awful to be forcefully benched on the sidelines, unable to even leave the house because of his fragile condition. But then again, what more could he have actually done? Of course, there were plenty more that he could have done. Led Shigaraki away from the plaza, played more defensively to preserve himself better, made sure none of his students stayed behind. But he took down rogue, nighttime villains and crime syndicates, not bioengineered monsters meant to kill the number one hero. No matter how he sliced it, no matter how cold or calculating he was, he just couldn't see what more he could have done, despite being able to list options in his head. He was getting a lot of migraines lately, and those only re-established that little voice in the back of his head. Recovery Girl had given him painkillers to help relieve the pressure in his temples, but even medical-grade aspirin could only do so much. Every throb sent him back to being slammed into the ground over and over and over. His head was so fuzzy, it was like he was losing all the blood all over again. The amount of pressure was reminiscent of being sick with a terrible case of the flu. And his head then collapsed into his hands. Just thinking about it made it too heavy to hold up, like all the energy was zapped out of him. He really needed to apologize to Yamada. He was only trying to help his recovery. In fact, that's all the blonde had been doing since he got home. He'd been so patient, and all he got in return was pent-up irritation. It was eating away at his conscience, and he wasn't doing much to stop it, sitting here all sulkingly. He also really needed another cup of coffee, because he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his weighted eyelids open, but right now, there was no way he could trust himself with preparation like that. He currently operated the equivalent of Butterfingers, and it was for everyone's sake that he was sat here and hoped that Yamada would come back soon, as painful as that. His broken body slumped down like a liquid. His arms were too dead to even reach for the TV remote, so instead he gave in to the fatigue, allowing his eyes to flutter shut. Though he would never get that far, halted by some remorseless force of nature, or maybe just the clink of a mug. His vision was a real mess, but it didn't bother him as much as the headache, so he tried not to complain about it, though even through his blurry sight there was no mistaking that rich green hue, and unless Midoriya decided to move his botany out to the kitchen, it was pretty self-explanatory. "Problem, child? Haven't seen you in a bit." In reality, it had to have been less than an hour, but his currently warped perception of time wasn't something that Aizawa caught on to yet. Midoriya, on the other hand, stood there like a deer caught in headlights. Thankfully, the mug was already placed in the sink, or else he likely would have had it slide out of his hands. He turned to his side, probably speaking to his ghost friend, or maybe just looking at him. Aizawa really couldn't tell from so far away, before awkwardly trying to compose himself. "I just came to drop off my cup." He shuffled in his spot, like a timid animal waiting for a chance to dart off, but the underground hero didn't want that. Maybe it was his own guilty conscience or his restlessness, but he desperately didn't want to be alone. It was kind of pathetic to admit, even if it was just to himself, but now was the time, if anything, to give in and accept it. "Why don't you sit with me for a moment?" he asked. "We sure haven't had a chance to talk in a while." In the minute that left his slurred lips, he immediately cursed his lack of brain cells, the pieces of conscience that were there, but he couldn't seem to put them together, like a toddler struggling with a puzzle of 100 pieces too large. He couldn't remember a time where the two of them had even talked in the first place, and as much as he wanted to help, there was no way in hell he could do this. What in the world was he thinking, in all aspects of the word? So when the boy hesitantly made his way over to sit next to him on the couch, albeit with a full cushion of space between them, he wasn't sure whether that could be considered success. Now that he was closer, Aizawa could note something in his lap, flat and beige in color, but other than that, he couldn't really pinpoint what it was. Already feeling the strain on his eyes, he leaned back again into the couch, closing them fully this time. He couldn't be pushing the limits on his eyesight, at least not after what Recovery Girl told him. "God, this has been such a mess," he groaned, the filter to his thoughts nowhere in sight. The teen only watched as he rubbed at his eyes, appearing like a worn-out drunkard, though he would never admit it out loud. "Every time I close my eyes, that thing's hand is right around my head." Those words just seemed to spill out of him, unsure of how to really start a conversation or keep it going. "Makes it hard to sleep at night, you know?" The teen shifted uncomfortably in his spot, not that Aizawa could pick it up with his eyes closed. He was almost tempted to say something, but held back on the sole premise of not knowing what to say at the time. "I don't remember too much after you and Asui stepped in. It's all just a blur. the hero admitted. I'm not too sure if that's for the better or the worse. And then Aizawa opened his eyes suddenly, coming to the grand realization he'd been unconsciously searching for, yet actively avoiding as well. I really didn't realize how terrified I was. As a hero, I'm supposed to make people feel safe, but sometimes I forget. I'm not invincible to fear either. Silence enveloped them after that, the thick and heavy kind that seemed to settle in the air, the kind that was so painfully obvious yet impossible to break. How could anyone, after such a heartfelt admission, pierce from their soul? I was so scared. It was hushed so softly it was nearly non-existent. It's like its very presence would disturb the universe. I tried so hard to keep up this brave face like you did, but Shigaraki saw right through it, and I couldn't do anything about it. Aizawa watched Midoriya shrink in on himself, wallowing in his own personal guilt as it slowly crushed him. Just witnessing it stabbed at his heart, made him feel like he was failing as a hero, as a teacher. The last thing he'd ever want is to see one of his students suffer alone, but this seemed to sting far worse. Problem child, you can't possibly blame yourself, he consoled. No one could have expected you to do any more with what the situation was. I expected me to do more, the teen cried all of a sudden, shooting his glance up to his bandaged face. I've been so confident in my abilities, and yet I keep falling short. Aizawa was more than confused. Falling short? Problem child, I wasn't good enough. He continued to rant, spilling out the guts that he'd been bottling for nearly a day. So many things could have gone wrong, and it would have been my fault. I was supposed to keep everyone there safe, and I was so close to screwing that up I might as well done that. The teen broke eye contact, feeling embarrassed and ashamed of himself. His shoulders sunk in on each other, and he was curling in like a hostile porcupine. Spines pointed outward and aggressive. It was easy to see he was anxious, not having planned to spill his guts at that particular moment, and it most certainly wasn't helping that Aizawa hadn't said anything in response, fueling the already uncomfortable silence. Then the teacher abruptly stood up, still without a word, and left the general area, retreating into the hallway. Midoriya stared in shock, unable to say a word as the person he had chosen to open up to just left before his eyes. He felt like breaking into tears and throwing up at the same time, that awful feeling of vulnerability, consuming him like a rabid dog. What was he thinking? How stupid was he to open himself up, especially to a Eraserhead of all people? He really needed to get up and leave immediately, back to the safety of his room where he could wallow in regrets alone. But his legs wobbled like jello, unable to support his weight in his current state. Gami, who'd been painfully silent throughout the entire ordeal, hovering off to the side in an attempt to give some privacy, carefully creeped closer to the overwhelmed boy that was seated on the couch. His non-existent heart broke with each fake step, unable to stop recalling the events from the day before, the words that had shot from his chest now being stomped upon by guilt. He reached the armrest where his successor was curled into and crouched to his knees, not bothering to target the empty space beside him. He leaned forward, passing straight through the couch entirely, and wrapped his skeletal arms around his eerily still form. Midoriya made no move to push him away, simply sitting there and staring blankly. His expression was too much for the poor ghost to take, and he ended up being forced to look away for his own emotional sake. I am sorry. What was he apologizing for? Well, a lot of things, and yet he couldn't bring any of those reasons to words. But what more could he do? Not that he thought that he was doing enough, he truly just didn't know. It's not your fault, Midoriya managed to mumble, his voice beginning to be wet with tears. How would you have known? That only made Gami hug him tighter, digging his bony arms into the flesh unknowingly. He should have known. It was his job to know. It was the only thing that he was good for, on this intangible plane, to help him, to know. Was he failing as a mentor, the one thing he was good for? No, I should have known. The teen made no effort to respond this time, staring blankly into space. He was lost in his own thoughts, yet he couldn't seem to pick out any one in particular. Was he angry at Gami? No, that was nearly impossible. Sure, there were moments where they lashed out. He lashed out at the ghost particularly, but that was his fault and his fault only. The spirit was always so patient with him, so considerate of his needs and feelings. He could never be angry at Gami, not now, not ever, and especially not for something that wasn't his fault. Was he angry at the world? Maybe. After all, he sure couldn't help anyone there. But then again, that really wasn't the world's fault. There was no point in taking out anger on the universe, especially when it would likely rebound back at him in some cruel, unfortunate manner. Then that only left being angry at himself. It was his fault, and he wasn't adequate enough in the first place. That fell on his skill and his abilities. How could he let himself grow so lax and uncaring about his improvement, to the point where it escalated so greatly as it did yesterday? What if he didn't have his immortality, or what if he had been struck somewhere more incapacitating sooner? He would have been down and out for the count. Aizawa might not have made it, Asui might not have made it, and the Nomu would have certainly gone off to hurt someone else. Dare he say kill? It was sickening, not only the constant what-ifs, but the thought of how truly useless he felt. Aizawa trudged down the hallway once more, surprised even through his foggy rationality that he was able to lift himself off the couch and to his bedroom in the first place. But miraculously he did, and now it was time to struggle on the way back, having retrieved what he needed. He slunked into the living room, passing by the painfully still Midori on the way back to his spot. Now that he was a little more awake, he noticed something that the boy's lap was rectangular, with the slightest hint of a manila hue. Was that the folder he remembered Tsukuji giving him the other night? He couldn't recall it coming from somewhere else, not to his knowledge at least, to which he could admit it was a little less than reliable at the moment. He plopped himself back onto the cushions, wincing at the recoil his nervous system took. Turning steadily to the teen next to him, the hero held out his adjacent hand, attempting to pass something he was holding over. Midoriya turned his head slowly, not sure how he felt upon Aizawa's return, but his weary gaze was met with something unexpected. The pro was holding out what seemed to be a small book, just larger than his palm. He couldn't make out the details from the distance he was at, but he could certainly admit he was intrigued, so maybe that's why he took it from him and held it closer to his face. The cover was barer than he expected, with only a simple man holding a staff in one hand. The background was solid, a mix of reddish-brown commonly seen in weathered bricks. In bolded, bright lettering the title read, "The Art and Science of Staff Fighting." Hizashi gave it to me one year for my birthday. It took Midori a second to recognize the name as Present Mike's. He wanted me to take up an extra means of defense while out on patrols, but it just wasn't for me. Aizawa sighed and leaned back, reliving the memory in his mind like a nostalgic record. His pause was long enough for the boy to return his stare back to the book in his hands, almost tempted to flip through the pages. "You can have it," the hero clarified, just in case Midori was hesitant, which he was. "You know, there's a pretty secluded area you could practice at, Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. It's just 15 minutes away from here. It used to have these huge trash piles, but someone's been cleaning it up. There's still enough trash to deter people from coming, though." Midoriya felt his heart skip a beat at the inadvertent recognition, but he kept his lips sealed. The flow of trash onto the beach was overwhelming, much more than he could ever hope to clear by himself, but he still managed to disintegrate a good chunk of it during his 10-month training period. Maybe it was time to pay the beloved beach a visit as well as some love. "Thank you, Aizawa-sensei," he found himself whispering, no longer holding that same intensity of betrayal he was rushed with earlier, though he couldn't help but feel that the man was making subtle jabs at him. Not that he was wrong to do so. He still needed all the help he could get. He needed to get better in his skills if he wanted to avoid the same close call with tragedy that tore him apart so mercilessly. "It's of more use with you than sitting on a bookshelf," the teacher admitted. "Besides, you should have plenty of time to practice if you're interested." Plenty of time. To his knowledge, today was the only day off, as UA had canceled school to revamp their security systems after yesterday's invasion, and it was already creeping into evening, so there was no way he was getting to leave to start today. Maybe he meant after school? Of course, there was always the point that Aizawa was simply holding on to another one of his secrets, like that spontaneous quirk apprehension test on the first day. Either way, he'd just have to wait and see, as experience told him that if the teacher didn't admit it now, there was no point in asking. Aizawa stretched his arms out, trying to work out the kinks in his nerves. Unfortunately, that didn't seem to go so well, as he subsequently winced and retracted his arms back to his chest. His head rolled around on his neck, trying to adjust and return to some semblance of comfort, and his gaze rested again on the manila folder in Midoriya's lap. And just like that, he was distracted again, wondering why the boy had bothered to bring it out with him in the first place. Was he going to show it to him? For what reason, the hero had no idea. In fact, he really didn't know what was in the folder to begin with. Midoriya had been fiercely protective over it since retrieving it, and neither Aizawa nor Yamada were about to fight him over it. If the teen came to them wanting to talk about it, then by all means he would certainly be all ears, not only to satiate his own curiosity, but this was clearly personal, and not something the pro was planning to force. Now if only someone could tell that to his impaired judgment. "So, problem child," he began, attempting to smooth over the light slur in his words. "What's up with the folder?" Midoriya shifted hesitantly in the corner of his eye. But the pro did his best not to stare, keeping his gaze focused on the room in front of him. Show, don't tell. He had brought out the folder himself. It was only fair for Aizawa to ask. He wouldn't push, definitely not, but there was nothing wrong with asking. At least, that's what kept ringing around in his head. I don't know. It was the truth. He had no idea what compelled him to bring it with him from the safe space of his room to begin with. He just couldn't put it down, even though at this point he desperately wanted to. He was the first to acknowledge how rough these past couple days had been on him. By no means was he trying to make it worse for himself, but he just couldn't stop. There was something so unresolving about looking at those few pieces of paper, and yet something else so utterly hypnotic. They weren't enough. He knew that for sure, but what would be enough? Was enough even possible? Midoriya tucked the book between his side and the armrest, placing it out of sight and out of mind. Once his hands were free, he tumbled his fingers around the edge and absent-mindedly was stroking it with his gloves, and then he did the unthinkable. He handed it over. There was no prompt, no instigation. He couldn't explain it. He'd gone through its contents over and over and over again, all within the span of less than a day. He'd read every line, studied every detail, analyzed each picture, of which there were few, and there was just nothing left for him in there. He wasn't satisfied. His loose end still hung there, limp and merely ruffled, but there was nothing more for him to get from that folder. It was just some dead weight that he'd been carrying around. Maybe that's why he could let it leave his hands so easy, and yet still watch its movements carefully, as if it'd run away from him the second it got the chance. Aizawa was certainly surprised, to say the least. He wasn't expecting to get a chance to look at the folder, at least not from Midoriya. He knew himself fairly well, and he knew his curiosity would bring him right into Tsukuchi's hands asking for a copy of the contents, but this way felt better, more satisfying to his conscience, and that's why he didn't hesitate to take the item from the teen's outstretched hands and flip through it as thoroughly as he could. The silence was painful, but expected. Midoriya certainly wasn't thinking his teacher would read the contents aloud, but that didn't make sitting there and waiting for him to be finished any easier. He loved silence, solitude, but not like this. This kind of silence made him anxious, like he was waiting for punishment, like he had just handed his mother a bad test grade. But he still found himself shuffling nervously in his spot, doing his best to not bother the teacher that was reading only a ways away from him. He was beginning to miss the feeling of holding the cardstock flaps, like he was addicted to it. He was addicted and he couldn't help it. He was addicted to the idea of finding answers, of finding resolution, and it wasn't there, but that's all he had. He just couldn't put it down, knowing that maybe if he just thought hard enough, he could find the answers he was frantically searching for. I just can't stop reading it. His thoughts blended into verbal words, and he found himself realizing it and not at the same time. Caring and yet not caring at all. I know it's not going to change, but maybe it's me? Am I missing something? Aizawa shot a glance at him, from the corner of his eyes, still holding the folder open in his lap. I just assumed that it would be the answer, that it could finally fill that missing piece that had been bothering me for so long. He continued, not bothering to acknowledge whatever gesture the man beside him was going for. But now, I'm even more confused than I was before. All I've got are more questions, and I don't know how much longer I can just sit around here and let them fester. The teen's voice spiked uncharacteristically, growing shaky and wet as his emotions did. Aizawa's attention was now fully focused on him, completely turned away from the curious contents of the folder that he finally got his hands on. He watched his student ball his fists into his sweatpants, bunching up the fabric tightly like it was his own skin. His limbs were trembling slightly, not too noticeable, but definitely there, though Aizawa couldn't place whether that was out of anger, desperation, hopelessness, or something else entirely. I kind of wish I had the chance to talk to him back then, or even yesterday in the flood zone, Midoriya admitted. I just want him to explain it to me. I just don't understand. The hero frowned, though it went unnoticed in Midoriya's blurry eyes. A small cascade of droplets fell directly from his hunched head and splashed onto his pants roughly. staining the fabric with spots of salty tears. He was quiet, though, and his sobs were non-existent, just a whirlpool of emotions finally breaking his stiff tear ducts. He was tired of letting this consume him, but no active thought of that could change him completely. It was as if he could see himself from the outside, see all his mistakes and shortcomings, and he was yelling and screaming at him to change, to just get over it already. But he couldn't hear himself. Or maybe he could, and he just couldn't get himself to care enough. Kiori Royami. It looks like a pretty normal guy to me, I mean, other than the whole villain thing, Aizawa commented, his filter practically nowhere to be found. Though I'd imagine there's more behind him after what you just said. Midoriya didn't bother to respond, tears still falling freely from his eyes. The pro sighed softly to himself, his shoulders finally dropping into relaxation. He hadn't even realized he was so wound up, or how he got like that, just to begin with. But his gut anxiously churned at seeing the boy next to him struggle alone, and twisted even more so at not knowing what to do to help. "What do you want to ask him?" The teen looked up, wiping his damp eyes before they trailed onto his cheeks. "I just want to understand. I just want to know why." Aizawa turned back to the folder in his lap, his phone suddenly feeling uncomfortable in his back pocket. He felt himself silently debate the options in his head while his eyes were passively skimming over the contents of one page after another. Full name, Kiori Ryuyami, age 38, height 5'11", weight 164 pounds, occupation sales manager at blank, address blank, quirk digidismissal, charges filed blank, charges dismissed, not applicable, bail blank, court date blank. He heard himself sigh more heavily this time, dropping his tense shoulders once again, though this time he had a better idea of how that came to be. He reached back for the phone that was now bothering him, slipped it from his pocket into his hand. He could feel the slightest hint of hesitation at Yamada's absence, but he'd deal with that hurdle when it got there. After all, he had other things to discuss when the blonde came home. Eraserhead turned and gave Midoriya a reaffirming nod, as well as a small smile, though that part was more of an unconscious effort than he realized. "I can't promise anything, problem child," Aizawa started. Trauma really was one son of a bitch, and he was getting really sick and tired of it butting into lives where it didn't belong. "But I'll see what I can do." All right, everyone, this concludes Chapter 25 of Deku and Death. Chapter 26 will be next. I hope you all are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.